For decades, Africa's wealth has fueled the growth of distant nations. Gold dug from its soil filled foreign banks. Its vast resources built skylines that rose far from the land that produced them. The continent's labor and promise have long served others, while its people watched their future managed from offices thousands of miles away. In the middle of West Africa lies Burkina Faso, a nation small in size but immense in spirit. For years, it stood quietly in the shadows of larger powers, enduring the same old story of dependence, of contracts written abroad, of profits vanishing beyond its borders. But something in that silence began to change. A young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, emerged with a conviction that independence could no longer live only in speeches or flags. To him, sovereignty had to be visible, something a person could touch, walk past, and point to. And so his government made a decision that would send ripples far beyond its borders. Earlier this year, Burkina Faso passed a law that would force every major company earning its fortune on Burkinabe soil to establish its headquarters within the country. Those unwilling to root their presence locally would have to leave. It was not an act of defiance for its own sake. It was an act of reclamation, a demand that the wealth born from this land should finally live in it. Across the region, observers were stunned. Some called it reckless, others revolutionary. But inside Burkina Faso, a sense of pride began to take hold. For once, the flow of power seemed to reverse direction. The nation that had long exported its value was now daring to anchor it home. This is the story of how one of Africa's smallest nations decided to challenge the oldest structure of economic control, and how its leader turned an idea of sovereignty into something concrete. What began as a policy may in time be remembered as the moment Africa started to rebuild ownership from the ground up. It began quietly, without fanfare or warning. On an ordinary morning in Ouagadougou, as the city stirred to life under the warm Sahel sun, something extraordinary unfolded inside the chambers of Burkina Faso's government. The Council of Ministers gathered, and within those walls, a decree was born, one that would shake the foundations of foreign business across an entire continent. The announcement moved swiftly through the networks of West African trade. At first it sounded like rumor too bold to be real. Then confirmation arrived. Burkina Faso was changing the rules. Any company making more than $8.5 million a year within its borders would be required to establish its headquarters inside the country, not a representative office, not a symbolic branch. A full command center built, staffed, and taxed on Burkinabe soil. The news hit like a storm. For decades, the country's gold mines had been managed from Paris, its telecommunications from Abidjan, and its banks from offices in Johannesburg. Corporations extracted profit from the land, but kept their decision-making far away. The system had worked smoothly for those abroad, and left little behind for the people whose hands made it possible. This time the balance was shifting. The government gave a clear deadline: 6 months. Within that time, every eligible company had to present construction plans for their new headquarters. To make the transition possible, the administration offered tax exemptions on building materials, streamlined permits, and a fast approval process that removed years of bureaucratic delay. For a country long trapped in red tape, it was an unexpected sign of efficiency and resolve. The initiative was more than policy, it was symbolism transformed into structure. Burkina Faso was telling the world that the days of remote control were ending. Every skyscraper built abroad with Burkinabe wealth would now find its reflection in the cities of Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and Fada Ngourma. Internationally, the reaction was immediate. Private chambers of commerce scrambled to interpret the implications. Some executives dismissed the idea as impossible. Others quietly began to assess land prices and construction opportunities. In Europe's boardrooms, the tone was cautious, even nervous. The question wasn't whether the law was serious, it was whether the government would have the courage to enforce it. Inside the country, the mood was different. Civil servants, small entrepreneurs, and ordinary citizens sensed that something irreversible had begun. Radio stations discussed it with awe, describing it as a moment when the map of African business might finally be redrawn. Urban planners once idle received new orders to identify building zones. Ministries collaborated to clear paperwork that had been piling up for years. And across neighborhoods, the conversations changed. For the first time, people began to imagine skylines shaped not by aid projects or foreign architects, but by the companies that had long profited from their land. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a technical reform, a rule about corporate addresses and taxation. But to those who understood the deeper history, it was a quiet revolution. It meant that decisions affecting Burkina Faso's economy would no longer be made in foreign capitals. The law placed the heart of economic power where it belonged within the nation itself. For a country often dismissed as peripheral, the act carried a weight far beyond its borders. It was the first time an African government had dared to demand that foreign corporations live where they earn. Beneath the surface, it was more than just enforcement. It was a reclamation of space, dignity, and visibility. The decree marked the beginning of a new chapter. The countdown had started. 6 months for global companies to choose whether they would root themselves in the land that sustained them or walk away. And in that moment, Burkina Faso stopped being a background player in Africa's economy. It became the stage where a new story was unfolding, a story of courage written not in speeches, but in cement and blueprints. The announcement spread like wildfire. From Paris to Johannesburg, from the trading floors of Abidjan to the quiet corridors of European embassies, a single decision from a small Sahelian nation had shattered a long-standing comfort. Boardrooms that once viewed Burkina Faso as a compliant outpost suddenly realized that the ground beneath them had shifted. The reactions came in waves. Financial analysts called emergency meetings. Trade organizations demanded clarification. Diplomats reached out to understand whether this was a temporary impulse or a lasting policy. But in Ouagadougou, the answer had already been decided. The decree was not an experiment. It was a declaration of permanence. For those who had long controlled the flow of wealth, it felt like losing an invisible privilege. For those within Burkina Faso, it felt like justice arriving decades late. The country often spoken of only in economic reports and mining statistics was now the center of attention. In the markets, small traders discussed the law with pride. The tone was cautious but hopeful. The feeling that their nation was finally standing up for itself began to replace the old resignation that nothing ever changed. Taxi drivers spoke of new roads that might come. Builders imagined contracts that had once been reserved for foreign firms. Students, long dreaming of leaving the country, began to ask whether opportunity might finally exist at home. At the same time, fear rippled through foreign investment circles. Western media outlets questioned whether the decision marked the beginning of isolation. Reports described the move as a sign of economic nationalism. Yet behind the critical headlines was an undercurrent of unease, a recognition that the era of easy profit might be ending. Inside government offices, officials worked with determination to turn the decree into reality. Ministries that had once operated in silos were now in constant communication. The urgency was palpable. Every department understood that this was not merely about buildings. It was about credibility. The world was watching to see if Burkina Faso could enforce what others had only dared to discuss. As the weeks passed, a new energy began to pulse through the capital. Surveyors appeared in the outskirts of the city, marking zones where the first corporate towers might rise. Construction firms, both local and regional, submitted proposals. Billboards started to appear showcasing architectural renderings of modern headquarters surrounded by solar grids and Sahelian motifs. For the first time in decades, the skyline of Ouagadougou was being imagined by its own people. But the transformation was not just physical, it was emotional. A sense of ownership began to take root in the national psyche. Older citizens, who had lived through years of dependency, saw in this law a reflection of something they thought was lost dignity. They remembered a time when African leaders spoke of self-reliance and believed in it. Now, those words were returning not as slogans, but as structures. Abroad, corporations faced difficult choices. Some considered compliance, calculating that the cost of building locally might be less than losing access to lucrative resources. Others planned quiet exits, unwilling to operate under the new conditions. In capitals far away, governments whispered about the precedent being set. If one country could demand this, what would stop others from following? For Burkina Faso, that question was the very point. The decree had never been about pleasing the outside world. It was about resetting the relationship between Africa and those who profited from it. The moment had become larger than the law itself. It was no longer about economics. It was about identity. The sight of surveyors' cranes and blueprints became symbols of a deeper revolution, one that did not need speeches or protests. It needed only time and the courage to see it through. By the time international investors began to adjust their expectations, something irreversible had already begun. The nation had found its rhythm. The old rules written elsewhere no longer dictated the pace of its future. And across Africa, quiet conversations started in government halls and university classrooms. People spoke of the Burkina model, an idea born from defiance, now spreading like a quiet fire across the continent. Months passed, and the law that once seemed like a distant proclamation began to take physical form. Across Burkina Faso's cities, the hum of construction replaced the stillness that had lingered for years. Cement trucks rolled through the streets of Ouagadougou. Cranes appeared against the skyline. Empty lots turned into foundations. What had begun as a bold declaration was now reshaping the country's landscape brick by brick. The transformation touched nearly every corner of society. Local architects, who once worked on small residential projects, found themselves designing corporate headquarters for the first time in their careers. Engineers who had struggled to find contracts abroad were now being called back home. The construction industry, long dependent on foreign contractors, was suddenly alive with local hands and local ideas. In workshops and factories, orders multiplied. Steel suppliers, furniture makers, and paint producers found new demand. Even the transport sector, often ignored, began to thrive as materials moved across regions. For ordinary families, the change was visible not only in the noise of machines, but in the steady rhythm of employment that returned to their lives. Yet this surge of activity was about more than jobs. It carried a sense of restoration. People began to look at the rising buildings with a quiet pride. For decades, their labor had been invisible, absorbed into profits that vanished beyond the borders. Now, they could see the results of their effort taking shape in the neighborhoods where they lived. Government ministries coordinated their efforts to ensure that this boom did not repeat the chaos of past growth. The Ministry of Urban Development mapped new economic zones to avoid uncontrolled sprawl. The Ministry of Environment introduced guidelines promoting sustainable design buildings that could withstand the Sahel's harsh climate while reflecting the region's traditional identity. Architects began to experiment with hybrid forms, glass towers with shaded courtyards, Solar panels atop sand-colored facades and entrances carved in patterns inspired by Sahelian motifs. The result was more than modern infrastructure. It was architecture that spoke the language of belonging. Every building became a statement that progress did not require imitation, that modern Africa could carry its own aesthetic. In cafes and markets, people began to speak differently about their country. The tone was still cautious, aware of the challenges ahead, but it was tinged with ownership. The idea of sovereignty, once an abstract concept reserved for speeches, had entered daily life. It could now be seen and touched: a tower here, a road there, a paycheck at the end of the month. But beneath the optimism lay quiet tensions. Not everyone welcomed the change. A few domestic elites tied to foreign partners feared losing influence. Some international investors delayed their commitments, hoping the government would soften its stance. Others attempted to negotiate exceptions behind closed doors. The state, however, remained firm, knowing that one concession could unravel the message it had worked so hard to build. Among the people, the determination was palpable. There was fatigue from years of dependence, but also a growing sense of dignity. For miners, builders, and students alike, the law was not merely about construction, it was about being seen, about reclaiming visibility in their own story. The social atmosphere of Burkina Faso began to shift. The law had become a mirror through which citizens saw their country differently. It no longer appeared as a place waiting for help, but as a land capable of commanding its own future. That realization carried political power, strengthening the bond between the leadership and the population. For Ibrahim Traoré's administration, this was perhaps the law's most profound success. It had turned policy into participation. The people were not just witnesses to reform, they were the builders of it. And as the first towers began to rise, reflecting the desert light in their windows, Burkina Faso seemed to be announcing to the world that sovereignty was no longer a dream. It had a shape, a skyline, and a heartbeat. Far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, the news reached capitals that had long considered the Sahel little more than a geopolitical backdrop. In Washington, analysts studied the new law with cautious attention. At first, the move seemed like a curious headline, another burst of nationalism from a distant land. But as reports came in, it became clear that something larger was unfolding, a quiet realignment of Africa's relationship with the global economy. For Western investors, the change was unsettling. The system they had known, predictable, profitable, and comfortably distant, was being challenged by a nation many could barely locate on a map. Financial institutions questioned whether Burkina Faso had just set a precedent others might follow. In private, some worried that this was the beginning of a wider reckoning, that Africa's resource frontiers might soon demand not charity but control. American media outlets approached the story with mixed tones. Some framed it as a radical experiment, a risky gamble that could deter investment. Others, especially independent commentators, saw in it a reminder of something familiar, the same spirit that once drove early America's own struggle for economic self-determination. To them, what Burkina Faso was doing echoed an older truth. Independence means little unless it controls its own wealth. Across Europe, the reaction was tinged with disbelief. Governments with historical ties to West Africa faced uncomfortable questions. For decades, they had benefited from a system that kept administrative power offshore. Now that order was being rewritten not through protest, but through policy. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Beijing, and parts of Latin America, the development was watched with quiet approval. These regions recognized the language of sovereignty and saw in Traoré's move an opportunity to build new alliances based on mutual respect rather than dependence. The geopolitical winds were shifting, and Burkina Faso had found itself unexpectedly at the center of a larger transformation. What startled many in the West was not simply the audacity of the policy, but its clarity. It wasn't anti-globalization, nor was it isolationism. It was a demand for accountability that those who profited from a nation's resources should also share in its risks and responsibilities. In that sense, it was less a rejection of capitalism than a moral correction to it. Among American citizens, particularly older generations who remembered their country's own fights for economic fairness, the story stirred a quiet empathy. They could see in Traoré's vision a familiar pursuit, the belief that prosperity must be built, not borrowed. It reminded them of the power of self-reliance and the cost of losing it. As global commentators debated whether the law would succeed, few could ignore its symbolic power. A landlocked nation had forced the world to look inward, to reconsider how wealth, labor, and justice intersect across continents. Whether one viewed it as defiance or wisdom, Burkina Faso had done something extraordinary. It had turned sovereignty into policy and made the world pay attention. As the dust settled and the first glass towers began to reflect the Sahel sun, Burkina Faso no longer looked the same. The skyline itself had changed, but so had something deeper, something within the people who walked those streets. For the first time in generations, the country's wealth, its labor, and its pride were converging in the same place. The transformation was quiet, almost humble. There were no grand celebrations, no sweeping declarations. Instead, there was work, steady, deliberate work. Brick by brick, floor by floor, the idea of sovereignty was being built into reality. The nation that once exported its value was now learning to contain it, to give it shape and permanence. Across the continent, other nations began to watch closely. In Niger, Mali, and Ghana, ministers whispered about the Burkina model. Students debated it in classrooms, while journalists framed it as the beginning of a continental awakening. What had started as one law in a small, landlocked country had become a mirror for Africa's long struggle to reclaim its place in the world. For many observers abroad, especially, those who had seen the cycles of history repeat the story felt both new and familiar. It spoke of a people choosing ownership over dependency, dignity over convenience. It reminded the world that true freedom is not granted. It is built, protected, and lived. And so, the question remains not just for Africa, but for all of us. When a small nation can demand accountability from global power, what excuse do larger ones have for silence? When those once called weak begin to rebuild from the ground up, what does that say about the strength we have forgotten in ourselves? Perhaps the rise of these new towers in Ouagadougou is more than an economic statement. Perhaps it is a reminder that every generation, no matter where it stands, must decide whether it will live by the rules it inherits or dare to write its own. If you believe that truth deserves to be heard louder than headlines, stay with us. And if this story moved you, share it so others may see that courage still lives in the corners of the world we too often overlook.